Thank you and welcome. Before I begin my introduction of our esteemed guest, Dr. Michael Birnbaum, and the topic at hand, I'd like to turn your attention to turning off your cell phones and to the program where you can read about the Center's activities, our mission of expansion. We have some exciting events coming up that I'd like to share with you. March 8th at 4 p.m., we're hosting a Jewish-Muslim lecture by Dr. David Baisi entitled Orhan Pamuk and Italo Svevo, Jewish and Muslim Parallels in Culture and Literature. And then for Yom HaShoah on April 19th at 4 p.m., Martha Fraser, the Assistant Director, is organizing a memorial entitled Yom HaShoah, Holocaust Remembrance Day, Service and Reflection, the Fate of Teenagers and Young Adults. During the summer between June 25th and 27th, the Center, in collaboration with Isabella Friedman Center, whose director is here, David Weisberg, we've organized an interfaith conference retreat in Connecticut for young aspiring educators entitled Going Forward, The Future of Religious Literacy, What Should We Teach Our Children About One Another? And in the fall, we are hosting a photographic exhibition entitled Besa, Albanian Muslims Who Saved Jews During the Holocaust by Norman Gershon. It will run from September 1st to December 15th, and we will host a public reception on October 11th. And a new workshop offering by Jeff Kahn, organized by Barbara Reynolds, Assistant Director, entitled Post-Holocaust Reconciliation in Germany, a Model for Transforming Prejudice, is on October 27th. So we have some very exciting and very strong programming throughout up until next spring. So welcome everyone. Welcome to the Holocaust, Genocide, and Interfaith Education Center's Spring Lecture. I'm honored to have here with me my dear friend and mentor, Dr. Michael Birnbaum. Before I share the many accolades and distinctions of this unique man, I want to say a few words about his continual support of my work as a Muslim and the Holocaust. Michael and I met on September 25th, 2003, the day that Edward Said passed away. He was a Palestinian Christian spokesman for Palestinian self-determination, and a historical critic in various disciplines. Michael and I met at Roberto's, an Italian restaurant on Jefferson Boulevard, down the street from Loyola Marymount University, where he and I had made a connection and worked together. I was very sad that day because of Said's death, and in that one day and moment, I had met another friend, intellectual, that I had admired as an undergraduate. That meeting almost 10 years ago has culminated in a mutual trust and faith between him, a Jew, and I, a Muslim. When I was first appointed to this position, Michael texted me and told me to be strong in the face of controversy, and that the path I had taken was going to be a challenge, but a good one. To hear his words and quotes that carried weight in the media and public, especially the Jewish community, held me in a certain esteem that I could not ever imagine. Thank you, Michael. Let me highlight briefly Michael's accomplishments, which you can also read in the brochure. Michael Birnbaum is a writer, lecturer, a teacher, consulting in the conceptual development of museums and the development of historical films. He is director of the Ziggy Ziering Institute, exploring the ethical and religious implications of the Holocaust at the American Jewish University in Los Angeles, where he is also a professor of Jewish studies. In the past, he has served as a Weinstein Gold Distinguished Visiting Professor at Chapman University, the Podlake Distinguished Visitor at Claremont McKenna College, the Ida E. King Distinguished Professor of Holocaust Studies at Richard Stockton College, and the Strassler Family Distinguished Visiting Professor of Holocaust Studies at Clark University. Birnbaum is the author and editor of 20 books, scores of scholarly articles, and hundreds of journalistic pieces. Of his book, After Tragedy and Triumph, Raoul Hilberg said, "All those who want to read only one book about the condition of Jewry in 1990 would do well to choose Michael Birnbaum. In his description of contemporary Jewish thought, he sacrifices neither complexity nor lucidity. Charles Silberman praised The World Must Know as, quote, a majestic and profoundly moving history of the Holocaust. It is a must-reading for anyone who would like to be human in the post-Holocaust world. The Village Voice praised Anatomy of the Auschwitz death camp, with the scholarship broad and deep makes this definitive book on one of our century's defining horrors. His most recent books include Not Your Father's Anti-Semitism, A Promise to Remember, The Holocaust and the Words and Voices of Its Survivors, and After the Passion Has Passed, American Religious Consequences, a collection of essays on Judaism and Christianity, religious tolerance and pluralism, occasioned by that controversy that swirled around Mel Gibson's film, The Passion. Michael is a very special and unique person. He's always garnering support from all communities to make the Holocaust a human story. Last September, he visited Morocco with Peter Geffen, where they held the first Holocaust conference on Muslim soil. And he's also an activist who speaks out for other faiths when he wrote in the Jewish Journal in response to the controversy surrounding Park 51, quote, lest we hear a reiteration by Jews of the false claim that Islam is not a religion, permit me to remind Jews that no less a religious authority than Maimonides regarded Islam as a religion. He lived in a Muslim world, read Muslim philosophers, and knew the Quran well, and had significantly fewer theological problems with Islam than he had with Christianity. Witness his 13 principles, end quote. I asked Michael to talk about the topic of commemorating and controversy because I struggle with memory and teaching the Holocaust. My question to him, as he is the expert who has developed and consulted numerous memorials and museums, was simple. How do we commemorate the Holocaust and do it in a way that we don't offend, neglect, ignore, and erect an idolatry that beckons tourism and not education and sentiment of grappling with the Shoah? Architecture is about monuments and graves, said the Viennese architect Adolf Loos at the turn of the 20th century. This meant that an individual human life could be commemorated by a single stone, slab, cross, a star. The simplicity of this idea ended with the Holocaust in Hiroshima and the mechanisms of mass death. Today, an individual can no longer be certain to die an individual death. And architecture can no longer remember life as it once did. The markers that were formerly symbols of individual life and death must be changed. And this has a profound effect on the idea of both memory and the monument. The enormity and horror of the Holocaust are such that any attempt to represent it by traditional means is inevitably inadequate. The memory of the Holocaust can never be nostalgia. In a prescient moment, in The Search of Lost Time, Marcel Proust identifies two different kinds of memory. A nostalgia located in the past, touched with a sentimentality that remembers things not as they were, but as we want to remember them. And a living memory which is active in the present and devoid of nostalgia for remembered past. The Holocaust cannot be remembered in the first, nostalgia mode, as its horror forever ruptured the link between nostalgia and memory. Remembering the Holocaust can therefore only be a living condition in which the past remains active in the present. And now, without further ado, I'll present Dr. Berghoff.
Thank you very much for an overly kind introduction. I hadn't intended to hear my eulogy. But I want to tell you, given the choice of hearing your eulogy or not hearing your eulogy, it's much better to hear your eulogy and the like. I want to say one thing jokingly that's very serious. There was a Many years ago I received, and it always marks the way in which I respond when I hear these wonderful introductions. Many years ago I received my first award in the media, and it was called the Silver Angel Award for the best program in religion in the media. And you have a problem when you receive a Silver Angel Award. The question is, who can you tell? I had teenage kids living at home then. Tell them you're an angel, they believe you're the devil incarnate. You can tell your wife, but your wife has two very basic problems. Will you please put the cap on the toothpaste? And will you please remember to put down the toilet, lift up the toilet seat, and then put down the toilet seat. So I did the only honorable thing a man can do under such circumstances, which is I told my mother. And my mother, who was then alive and a wonderful woman and wise, I would say wise beyond her years, but she was then well into the biblical years of her strength, said, okay, you're an angel, now try being a mensch. And everybody should be blessed with such a mother and with such an attitude. Let me say that also I'm pleased to be here. I taught, the one credential that you left out is I taught for 15 years at Georgetown University, which was a Jesuit institution and therefore arguably a Roman Catholic institution, which Roman Catholics fully understand how that's not a humorous statement. So I feel very at home in Manhattan College, and I want to say this, that I also enjoyed the greatest of academic freedom working in Roman Catholic University. They were much nicer to Jews than Jews. And freer to say many different things that I would get into trouble for saying in my own university. I also want to congratulate this university for having the courage to choose a person absolutely on merit, with disregard to the tensions that is in the interreligious world in which we live and the attitude, and having the courage also to withstand the controversy and the discomfort. Because if you want the essence of my speech, and the rest is going to be commentary, that controversy and discomfort is an enormous tool of education. And one has to go right to the center of it in order to absolutely be creative. And this college is in the midst of doing that with a wonderful human being, who is also a fine scholar, who is also growing enormously, and you had the wisdom to have her at the beginning of what will surely be a distinguished career. So the provost is here, some of the department chairmen are here. They already have that in writing. They have done wisely and well. A word about, now I'm going to share with you what are some of the problems that we face on a daily basis as we begin to create museums and as we begin to create things that, elements that deal with, and institutions, whether it be films, books, or works that deal with Holocaust. Just a word about the creation of museums. I had a unique privilege. I was very young when accidentally I was invited to become the deputy director of the President's Commission on the Holocaust. And knowing nothing about museums, I got to do a lot of thinking about museums. I left the project for about 7 years, and they were in the story of Joseph, they were the 7 lean years, and I came back for the 7 productive and fat years, which may or may not have been an accident, but it was fortuitous luck at least. And I had an awful lot of time to do it, and I also had one other great advantage, which is they had chosen lots of people who knew things about museums but didn't know the Holocaust. And after failing and failing and failing and failing and flailing, they decided, let's reverse it, let's choose somebody who knows the Holocaust and who then will learn something about museums. We created a philosophy of museums, and the philosophy of the museum can be told in several ways. The first principle is the place from which you remember an event shapes the way in which you remember it. Place is a geographical location, but place also is a place in time and in space. Now, this is not an alien principle to biblical tradition, because one of the first lines we say is Al Naharot Bavel Shem Yashavnu B'Gam Bachinu B'Zachrenu Et Zion. By the rivers of Babylon we sat and we wept as we remembered Zion. The place from which you remember shapes how you remember. And the idea was that you remember differently in Jerusalem than you would in Warsaw, differently in Auschwitz than you would in Treblinka, differently in Berlin than you would in Budapest, differently in Washington than you would in New York, and different in Los Angeles than you might in Chicago. And place also has a second connotation, which is the place in time you are, how close to the event you are. And part of the very interesting things about place is that place shapes a task. Let me give you a very simple example. Berlin had a long debate over the creation of a Holocaust memorial in Germany. Let me put it in a little bit of an exaggerated fashion, but on a scale of 1 to 10 of exaggeration, this is about 1.5. One was too large and one was too small, one was too powerful and one was not powerful enough. One was too pessimistic and the other was too optimistic. One was too suggestive and the other did not say a lot. They then chose an American Jewish architect by the name of Peter Eisman, who created an incredible collection of sort of slabs of granite coffins that create a maze. And the very interesting thing is that there was a national requirement in Berlin that the capital of Germany, if Berlin was to be the capital of Germany again, it had to confront in a very deep way what it was like when it was the last time the capital of Germany, when it was the capital of Nazi Germany. They couldn't get away with not having a memorial. And then they discovered something remarkable after 10 or 12 years of debate as to the nature of this memorial. And those of you who have been to the Berlin Memorial, one of the elements about the Berlin Memorial that is problematic is you can see out of the maze virtually all the time, which means that in essence you're protected as you go through the experience. Because you can always refer to yourself to time and place and get out of it, while if you could never see out of it, it would be too frightening. If you can see out of it all the time, it's a little bit too loose. They then discovered that it didn't work, not for the older generation where it worked magnificently, but for the younger generation that didn't know the story. Therefore, they had to dig down underneath and create, inch for inch, what is one of the most powerful Holocaust exhibitions, which is the educational experience underneath the memorial, because a memorial that doesn't tell the story is insufficient for a community that no longer knows the story, meaning the younger people who did not live through it. We faced the problem. Now, we created a language of museum, which is a language of museum that I shape in all of my work, and that is we created a language museum, which is a museum as a storytelling institution. There are three storytelling mechanisms in the modern world. Storytelling, by the way, is as old as what our Bible, both of our Bibles, in fact. The Bible begins with the story of creation. It goes through Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. It goes through the story of Moses, and it continues on and on in narrative. And what are the Gospels if not the story of those who lived in proximity to Jesus, telling that story, re-speaking that story again and again and again, and telling it as narrative. When I deal with it, I sometimes say, you know, the essence of Jewish thinking is instead of saying in unity there is strength, we say 2 dogs killed a lion. How did 2 dogs kill a lion? Why did 2 dogs? That's where commentary comes in. But the idea of a storytelling institution, so what are the storytelling institutions of the contemporary world? A novel, a movie, and a museum. What's the difference between a movie and a museum? A movie has a captive audience and moving imagery. And a museum has captive imagery and a moving audience. And consequently, if you're going to shape the museum, you shape by the nature of the story you tell, all of the elements that move the audience from one stage to another, to a third, to a fourth. And there are different techniques. You can either have the freedom to move, or you try to do it with sound and light and narration, or you try to do it with the sheer power of the narrative. The second principle we had is, if I were to come to the Metropolitan and give them 100 Picassos, they would develop a Picasso wing. If I gave them 20 Rembrandts, they would deal with a Rembrandt wing, and then they'd supplement it with Dutch masters. Because most museums essentially tell the story of the artifacts they have. We reversed the metaphor and we said we want to tell a story, and we use the artifact as the midwife of telling the story. Meaning that the artifact is not a value not only a value in and of itself, but it's a value as the vehicle for telling a story. So if you've been to Washington, you know the power of the railroad car. And the power of the railroad car is precisely that's where it shapes you as you go through the experience of deportation. And elsewhere we'll show how that's shaped. You had several problems in the inception of the United, and by the way, and let's talk about it, when we shaped the President's Commission on the Holocaust, the question was, where do you build? Do you build a memorial museum? And notice it's called the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, 2 functions, memorial and museum. Do you build it in the city with the memorial, with the largest Jewish community? Do you build it for the community? Or do you say that we can transport it to the center of American national life, and it has something profound to say to the American future? What is the cost of that? What is the power of that? What is the opportunity of that? And what is the responsibility of that? And will people be actually interested? And consequently, the decision that we made in the early years was we make it in Washington, not New York. Not that New York shouldn't have a museum. The Museum of Jewish Heritage does that. But the idea is that if you build it in Washington, you're saying something about what it says to the national conscience. It's a national conscience. And then we got a piece of land that was controversial, because one of the issues is it on the mall or not on the mall? We did a focus group, and the focus group had no objection to a Holocaust museum that was adjacent to the National Mall, but had a deep objection to a Holocaust museum that was on the National Mall, marring the holy sacred space. Now, we then decided that the controversy is an opportunity. And by the way, that reflected itself in architectural choice, for example, to take the museum's memorial part and to make it go back 20 feet with the principle that it would only stand on the sight lines of the building next door, which was the Mint, as if somehow sight lines became sacred territory. So they shrank it because they didn't want it on the mall. They did that as an architectural decision, but maybe behind it was we don't want it that close. We then said, wait a minute here, if we're building it in Washington, we want to make it something that is the counter-testimony to everything around us. So what did we do with the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum? We first of all made a virtue of its necessity, and then a principle of its location. Everywhere on the National Mall, they celebrate the triumph of humanity. Human power in art and music and literature and technology and space and science, in economics. The power and the majesty of government. The monuments, it's the museum in Monumental, Washington, just adjacent to Governmental, Washington. So we positioned the museum in such a way that it would say, okay, but human power can be used for the creative good. Government can be used as an instrumentality of protecting and defending human rights, and government can be used what? As an instrumentality of oppression. The choices within the nature of government and the power of the values that undergird that. So we became the dark side of humanity, the darkest expression of human beings when they use the power that is celebrated absolutely elsewhere, and they marshal it not toward preserving human rights and human dignity, but to destroying human rights and human dignity, destroying people. So the idea is that you take what you face as a challenge and you use that power to create in such a way that you, in a very deep sense, in a real sense, magnify the importance. Second problem we faced, and we faced this in a certain respect during the chairmanship, and I was not there at that time, during the chairmanship of Elie Wiesel. And I say this with love for Elie Wiesel, with reverence for his achievement. But Elie had a major problem because if you read his work, the story of the Holocaust cannot be told. Only those who were there will ever know, and those who were there can never tell. Now, I had to understand this, and it took me a long time, and I've written a book on Elie. The question is, how could a man at one hand speak for silence and not speaking about it, and yet write 56 books that, speak about it all the time, give hundreds of speeches that talk about the Holocaust? And then I read a segment in Martin Buber's book in which he said, the more powerful the event, the more it invites the silence of all tongues. But speak we must. Such is the melancholy of man, also his greatness. And all of a sudden I realized that what Elie was speaking about was that if he really were to be faithful to the event, he would have to remain silent. But the urgency to speak was absolutely profound. Therefore, what comes out is melancholy and greatness, but also silence and the sense that to speak is to betray. Those of you in this Catholic institution, or arguably a Catholic institution, those of you who understand that maybe the greatest mystics never wrote anything and we have no access to what they experienced of God. Every mystic we read encountered God and came down to write inadequately in the human form, and to speak of their experience in the human form. Maybe the greatest mystics really opted for silence. And all we have are the poor compromises who tried to give voice, inadequate as it may be, to their experience. So when we began to create after Elie's chairmanship, we took the first part of his story seriously.